Okay, so you want to own a mobile home park. You've probably pictured it the way most people do. A slightly run-down gravel lot on the edge of town, a few dozen aging trailers, a handwritten lot rent due sign taped to a mailbox, and an owner who checks in once a month to collect rent checks and maybe unclog a drain. It doesn't look like real estate. It looks like the neglected, low-status cousin of real investing, the kind of thing you drive past and never think about twice. Here's the problem. That picture is almost completely wrong. The trailer parked on the lot isn't really the asset you're investing in. The real asset is a monopoly on the one patch of ground a house that can't legally or financially move is sitting on. You're not really renting housing. You're renting the only place in a 100-mile radius that a $50,000 manufactured home is allowed to exist. Let's start with two tenants walking into two completely different rental situations on the exact same Tuesday. Tenant A signs a lease on a brand new luxury apartment downtown. Granite countertops, a rooftop pool, $2,200 a month. It's the kind of unit that looks, on paper, like the crown jewel of any landlord's portfolio. Big number, flashy amenities. A tenant who looks financially solid the moment they sign. Tenant B moves an aging single-wide manufactured home onto a gravel lot in a modest mobile home park on the edge of the same city and pays $600 a month in lot rent. Nothing about this looks impressive. There's no granite. There's no rooftop pool. The monthly number is roughly a quarter of what the apartment brings in. Now flip it. The apartment complex tenant A signed into has an average tenant turnover rate of roughly 47% a year, meaning the average lease there survives about 2 years before someone moves out. The unit sits empty for a few weeks, and the landlord eats a cleaning bill, fresh paint, new carpet, a leasing commission, and lost rent during the vacancy. Routinely $3,000 to $5,000 per turnover, sometimes more. Tenant B's mobile home park has an average annual turnover of about 2.2% because moving a manufactured home off that lot costs the resident somewhere between $5,000 and $15,000 out of pocket. Tenant B isn't loyal. Tenant B is structurally, physically stuck. Which tenant is actually more valuable to the landlord? It isn't close. One is a lease. The other is a subscription enforced not by a contract, but by the sheer cost of physically hauling a house down the highway. Let's actually run those numbers side by side, because this is where it gets interesting. The luxury apartment brings in $26,400 a year at full occupancy, but average tenancy there runs about 2 years. So over a 20-year window, you're looking at roughly 10 separate turnovers, each one costing something in the neighborhood of $4,000 once you count vacancy days, cleaning, and releasing costs. That's $40,000 in pure friction bleeding out of the deal over 2 decades, on top of ongoing maintenance for a building the landlord fully owns and has to repair every time something breaks. The mobile home lot brings in $7,200 a year in lot rent. Over that same 20-year window, with a resident who is functionally unable to leave, that's $144,000 in rent collected off one small patch of gravel, with close to zero turnover cost, because the home itself, the thing that actually breaks, ages, and needs repair, belongs to the resident, not the landlord. Multiply it out, and that boring $600 a month lot over the same time horizon out-earns the flashy $2,200 apartment on a total return basis once you account for the turnover bleed and the fact that the landlord never has to fix a leaking roof, a broken dishwasher, or a busted water heater inside the actual home. This is the first thing to understand about mobile home parks. The trailer isn't really the product. It's the anchor. The actual product being sold is access to a fixed, artificially scarce piece of land that the resident's most valuable physical possession is now legally and financially chained to. The same category of asset as an airport gate slot or a taxi medallion, except this one comes with a mailbox. Think about how different this is from any other landlord-tenant relationship. A normal landlord owns the building and has to maintain a depreciating structure full of appliances, plumbing, and finishes that wear out constantly. A mobile home park owner rents out dirt, water, sewer access, and a road, and lets the resident own, insure, and repair the actual house sitting on top of it. The home isn't the asset here. The land underneath it is. And once a $50,000 house is parked on your acre, that resident isn't really your tenant anymore. They're your captive. If you're finding this breakdown useful, this is a good moment to hit subscribe. It genuinely helps the channel keep making these. So let's peel this apart layer by layer, because the land lease itself is only the entry point. If the lot rent is the doorway, the first layer inside it is the base rent roll, and this is where most people assume the entire business lives. It's actually a surprisingly high margin layer. National average lot rent sits around $600 a month, with fast-growing Sunbelt markets like Florida seeing lot rents climb 5.5% to 11% a year. Because the landlord isn't maintaining the actual homes, professionally run parks report expense ratios of only about 30 to 44% of gross revenue, meaning 56 to 70 cents of every collected dollar drops to net operating income, a margin most apartment landlords who are stuck repainting and recarpeting units every 2 years would kill for. If base rent is the entry point, utility recapture is where a huge and mostly invisible second income stream lives. A staggering number of older mom-and-pop run parks have historically underbilled residents for water and sewer usage, sometimes not billing it back at all. Buyers who come in and install proper sub-metering and utility bill-back systems routinely uncover tens of thousands of dollars a year in previously uncollected revenue. In one real underwriting example, on a 100-lot park, utility recapture alone added $35,000 in annual income that the previous owner was simply eating. That single fix is one of the reasons professional buyers routinely underwrite a park's income 20 to 40% higher than what the seller's own trailing financials show. Then there's a layer most residents never think about at all: ancillary fees, late fees, pet fees, storage fees, RV parking fees, application fees, individually tiny $5 or $10 or $25 here and there, but collectively another meaningful slice of other income on top of rent. And almost pure profit, since there's no cost of goods attached to charging someone $25 for a dog. In that same 100-lot underwriting example, ancillary fees added another $8,000 a year, money that shows up entirely as margin. The fourth layer is where operators start actually owning inventory instead of just leasing dirt, park-owned rental homes. Rather than waiting for someone to bring their own manufactured home onto a vacant lot, some operators, UMH properties among the most aggressive, buy and place their own homes on lots and rent out the entire package, land and house together, at a much higher monthly rate than lot rent alone. UMH added over 100 rental homes in a single quarter recently and was targeting 800 more across the year, backed by a pipeline of hundreds of homes already paid for and sitting ready to deploy. This layer captures housing profit that a pure land lease model leaves entirely on the table. There's a fourth and a half layer worth pausing on because it explains why so much capital has quietly flooded into this asset class over the past decade. Pad pricing itself has been rising, even as the rent underneath it stays modest. The median price paid per lot in a transacted park hit roughly $52,000 in 2025, up from about $38,000 just 5 years earlier, even after cooling off from a 2022 peak closer to $58,000. That's appreciation happening on a piece of dirt that in many cases hasn't changed at all. No renovation, no new amenities, just the market repricing the same acre because demand for the underlying asset class kept climbing faster than supply ever could. Which brings us to the fifth and most important layer, the one that makes the whole business model make sense: the compounding relationship between rent and valuation itself. In a 100-lot park, raising rent by just $25 a month adds $30,000 a year to net operating income. At an 8% cap rate, that single modest bump adds roughly $375,000 to the value of the property, instantly, on paper, the moment the rent roll updates. This isn't a subscription in the software sense, but it behaves exactly like one. Small, boring, recurring rent increases don't just add income, they get multiplied through the cap rate math into enormous jumps in asset value. The lot rent isn't the product. The lot rent is the input the entire valuation engine runs on. But operating this is far messier and far less passive than most first-time buyers assume. And this is where a mobile home park starts to look less like a simple landlord business and more like a tiny privately owned municipal utility that also happens to collect rent. A normal apartment building doesn't need to operate its own water treatment system, its own septic field, or miles of underground sewer line the owner is fully responsible for. A mobile home park built 40 or 50 years ago very often does, and none of that infrastructure gets cheaper to fix the longer it's ignored. First, there's water and sewer infrastructure. Many older parks run on private well and septic systems, or aging shared water mains installed decades before modern code, and repairing or replacing that infrastructure is not optional once it starts failing. It's the single biggest source of surprise capital expenditure in this asset class. Second, there's road maintenance, since most parks own and are responsible for every internal road, and gravel or asphalt in a park that sees daily traffic degrades fast without a real maintenance budget. Third, there's the homes you don't own, but still have to manage the appearance of. A resident who lets their home fall into disrepair drags down curb appeal, resale value, and occupancy for everyone else, and the park owner has almost no direct control over an asset they don't own. Fourth, there's insurance, which keeps climbing as underwriters price in the age of the infrastructure and the increasing frequency of severe weather in many growth markets. And finally, there's the cost nobody enjoys mentioning. Buyer due diligence routinely finds that a seller's trailing financials understated true expenses, meaning the real sustainable expense ratio is often meaningfully higher than what a rosy listing memo suggests. And here's what makes the math genuinely uncomfortable. Unlike a vacant apartment that simply sits empty and costs you nothing extra while you wait for a new tenant, deferred infrastructure in a mobile home park gets more expensive the longer you wait. A cracked sewer main doesn't heal itself. It gets worse, backs up more often, and eventually forces an emergency dig instead of a planned repair, which is exactly why this business is really running two completely different operations at once. A real estate leasing business collecting monthly rent checks, sitting directly on top of a tiny, self-contained utility company responsible for water, sewer, and roads that most owners never budgeted to actually run. Very few first-time buyers are equipped to think like a utility operator, and that mismatch is exactly where undercapitalized operators get into trouble. And if you think infrastructure is the complicated part, resident and home ownership dynamics are usually worse. Because residents own their homes but not the land, the park owner has almost no leverage over the physical condition of a huge share of the property's visible assets, and a handful of neglected code-violating homes can trigger local government pressure, complaints, and occasionally forced remediation that the park owner has to navigate even though they don't own the structures causing the problem. Sophisticated operators don't just track occupancy, they track net operating income per site and infrastructure capital expenditure per site, because those two numbers together tell you whether a park is a cash machine or a slow-motion money pit disguised as one. The lot rent is the hook. What's buried underground is the profit, or the trap. There's a second layer to this same problem that catches almost every first-time buyer off guard: the gap between what a seller reports and what a park actually costs to run. Because so many parks are still owned by aging mom-and-pop operators without professional bookkeeping, trailing financials routinely understate true operating costs, which is exactly why experienced buyers underwrite the real sustainable expense ratio 20 to 40% higher than whatever number appears on the seller's tax return. Skip that step, and you're not buying the cash-flowing asset in the marketing brochure. You're buying whatever's actually rusting underground, sight unseen. So if base rent already carries a healthy margin, why are the biggest operators increasingly buying and renting out their own homes instead of just collecting land rent forever? Because owning the housing layer does something a pure land lease can never do. It captures the profit on the actual dwelling, not just the dirt underneath it, and it locks in a resident before they've even had the chance to bring their own competing home onto the lot. USMH's rental home program runs at meaningfully higher margins than land rent alone, because the same underlying land asset now generates two stacked income streams instead of one. The math on floor space here is almost absurd. A single rental home placed on one lot can generate 2 to 3 times the pure land lease rent from that same physical square footage, because the operator is now capturing rent on both the dirt and the structure. Some operators are also layering in a second service tier, financing the home itself to the resident through in-house or affiliated lending, since manufactured homes typically don't qualify for a conventional mortgage and instead get financed through higher-rate chattel loans secured only by the depreciating home. Once a resident is locked into both a land lease and financing on the home sitting on it, the switching cost isn't measured in inconvenience anymore. It's measured in the literal physical impossibility of walking away without abandoning collateral. This is also why the rental home strategy multiplies each resident's touchpoints with the operator. A pure land lease tenant interacts with the park owner maybe once a month when rent is due. A rental home tenant interacts with them as landlord, lender, and property manager all at once, which means more opportunities to sell renter's insurance, maintenance plans, or an upgrade to a newer home down the line. The same way, a single loyal customer becomes several smaller revenue lines instead of one. Now here's where the story turns toward who actually wins this fight at scale versus who's still quietly running the show, because the gap looks nothing like most consolidated industries. Equity Lifestyle Properties, the largest player in the space, owns or holds interests in 451 properties and roughly 172,000 sites, commanding an estimated 14% of category revenue. Sun Communities runs close behind with around 285 manufactured housing communities and 97,000 lots, holding roughly 11% of the market. In just the past few years, 3 separate $2 billion transactions reshaped the top of the industry. Sun acquiring Carefree Communities, Brookfield Asset Management buying Northstar, and Singapore's sovereign wealth fund, NEEC, purchasing Yes Communities outright. And yet, even with all of that capital pouring in, the United States has roughly 40,000 mobile home parks, and only about 4,000 of them, less than 10%, belong to institutional owners at all. Add up every single operator in the top 100 nationally, and they collectively own only about 4,000 parks combined. Becoming a top 100 owner in this industry takes roughly 600 lots, the equivalent of 6 or 7 mid-sized parks. Cracking the top 100 apartment owners in America, by contrast, takes more than 70,000 units. For comparison, self-storage, an asset class investors already consider consolidated, is roughly 3 times more concentrated than mobile home parks are today, which tells you just how much runway institutional buyers still see ahead of them here. This is one of the most fragmented real estate asset classes left in the country, and independents survive not by trying to outscale institutional buyers, but by staying small, local, and personally embedded enough that a REIT's acquisition team never even finds them. A mom-and-pop owner who's run the same 40-lot park for 25 years, who knows every resident's name, and lets a family slide a week on rent during a rough month, builds a kind of goodwill that shows up nowhere on a balance sheet. But it's exactly why that park rarely goes up for sale on the open market in the first place, and exactly why off-market deals remain the way most experienced buyers actually break into this space. Technology hasn't disrupted this industry the way it's disrupted retail or media. You can't order a mobile home lot online the way you order a car wash membership, but it has quietly rewired how deals get found and how income gets collected. Professional revenue management software, automated utility sub-metering, and online deal marketplaces have made off-market parks far more visible to institutional buyers than they were a decade ago, which is a big part of why transaction volume jumped over 47% in a single recent year, with roughly 460 communities changing hands. The hidden cost of that visibility is that the old advantage, quietly buying an overlooked, undermanaged park nobody else knew existed, is shrinking every year as more capital learns exactly where to look. What genuinely can't be disrupted is the supply side. Zoning restrictions and neighborhood opposition make building brand new mobile home parks in most desirable markets nearly impossible. So unlike apartments, which face a constant risk of new competing supply down the street, this industry's total lot count is essentially fixed, and in many metro areas, quietly shrinking as older parks get redeveloped into something else entirely. Regulation has moved in a very specific direction here, and it cuts both ways. States including Colorado, Oregon, and Minnesota have passed right of first refusal laws giving residents or resident cooperatives the first opportunity to buy their community when it comes up for sale. And states like North Carolina, Tennessee, and South Carolina have added tighter notice to vacate requirements after high-profile displacement incidents, including one in Cary, North Carolina, that drew national attention to the risks embedded in the land lease model. On the surface, this looks purely like added friction, but for professional operators with real compliant systems already in place, the growing regulatory burden functions as a moat, quietly filtering out casual, undercapitalized buyers who can't afford the legal overhead. It's the affordable housing goodwill of the business, minus most of the amateur competition that used to flood the space looking for an easy score. The retention layer in this business doesn't run on reminder texts or loyalty apps the way a subscription business does. It runs on physical reality. The free tier, so to speak, is simply the cost of moving. $5,000 to $15,000 to relocate a manufactured home is functionally a cancellation fee no landlord ever had to design because it was baked into the resident's decision the moment they placed their home on the lot. The paid tier is everything a well-run park layers on top: maintained roads, a responsive on-site manager, community events, a sense of stability that reduces the odds a resident fights back hard against a modest annual rent increase. The key number underneath all of it is turnover, roughly 2.2% a year here, compared to roughly 47% in a typical apartment complex. The entire point was never to win this month's rent check. It's to own the next 20 or 30 years of payments from someone who is, quite literally, unable to easily leave. So where is this industry actually heading? Put three things together and the direction gets clear. First, institutional consolidation keeps compressing cap rates on premium Sunbelt assets from roughly 5.5% to 6.5% a decade ago, down to 4 to 5% today, rewarding scale and professional management even as the overall market stays deeply fragmented. Second, the park-owned rental home model, pioneered aggressively by operators like UMH, keeps expanding, blending land lease income with housing rental income into a single stacked revenue stream on the same acre of dirt. Third, the regulatory landscape keeps getting more sophisticated state by state, turning legal and compliance infrastructure into a genuine competitive advantage rather than just an annoyance. Put all three together, and the mobile home park of the future looks less like a mom-and-pop trailer court collecting cash by hand and more like a professionally managed micro-utility with its own in-house home rental arm and its own legal department. A good year in this business looks like occupancy holding near 94% nationally, disciplined 5 to 7% annual rent growth, a properly executed utility billback program, and a net operating income margin somewhere in the 55 to 65% range. The kind of performance that lets premium assets trade at compressed 4 to 5% cap rates when it's time to sell. Only one or two things need to go wrong to flip that picture entirely. A major water main fails and eats 6 figures in emergency repair costs in a single season. A new state law freezes rent increases faster than an operator underwrote for. A neglected home or two triggers a code enforcement standoff that scares off prospective new residents. A displacement controversy like the one in Cary, North Carolina draws local media attention, and suddenly the county planning office is scrutinizing every permit you file. Any one of those can drag NOI margin from the mid-60s down toward 30%. And from the road, a struggling park and a thriving one look completely identical. Same gravel driveways, same double wides, same faded little community sign out front. So here's the full picture, beginning to end. A mobile home park looks from the outside like a rundown, low-status corner of real estate. Cheap land, older housing, a landlord who shows up once a month to collect rent. From the inside, it's built on a completely different foundation, a land lease monopoly wrapped around residents who are physically, financially unable to leave, generating recurring cash flow with turnover rates apartment landlords can only dream about. The real profit centers aren't the rent checks themselves. They're the utility recapture nobody billed for, the ancillary fees that cost nothing to collect, the rental home program stacking housing profit on top of land rent, and the almost mechanical way a small rent increase multiplies into a massive jump in asset value through the cap rate. If you're going to own one of these, you're not really buying a trailer park. You're buying a piece of irreplaceable land with a captive tenant base, wrapped around a tiny utility company you never signed up to run. If you want the full breakdown of what it actually takes to underwrite and buy one of these, there's a link in the description. And if this was useful, subscribing genuinely helps this channel keep making them.